2 o'clock. In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday in question time, the Prime Minister said the more than 100,000 people who joined the Women's March for Justice around the country were lucky because in other countries they would be met by bullets. Rather than describe this as a triumph, why doesn't the Prime Minister listen to those who marched and take real action on gendered violence?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That is an egregious misrepresentation of what I said in this House yesterday,
Members on my left.
Speaker. Partisanised, as I've become very used to the Leader of the Opposition doing on such sensitive issues, Mr Speaker. If the Leader of the Opposition was indeed listening yesterday, Mr Speaker, he would have heard me say that it was good and it was right, Mr Speaker, that those who came to this city yesterday and around the country and voiced their frustrations and their strong concerns, and that is exactly what I said, Mr Speaker. I also said it was good to live in a country, Mr Speaker, where there is a right to protest, Mr Speaker, and that there is the rule of law. And, Mr Speaker, there is the opportunity for Australians to speak with such a voice in this country. And it is also the case, Mr Speaker, sadly it is the truth. Sadly it is the truth, as I was seeking only to represent yesterday, Mr Speaker, that in many countries, sadly, that is not the case. That is a cause for celebration of Australia's democracy. Mr Speaker, it may be not the matter that the Leader of the Opposition has had to turn much attention to recently, but as Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and I have been involved on an almost daily basis with the issues that have been unfolding in Myanmar, Mr Speaker, and seek the release of Professor Sean Turnell, Mr Speaker. So it is not surprising that as Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, these matters of the absence of democracy, of the absence to right to process, at the absence of the rule of law, Mr Speaker, are very much foremost on my mind. I celebrate our democracy. I celebrate the right to protest, Mr Speaker. I think it is good and right that Australians came from around the country and gathered in their cities yesterday and voiced their strong concerns, as I was pleased, of course, to give leave for those petitions to be tabled at the start of this question time, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition may seek to partisanise what is a highly sensitive issue, Mr Speaker, as the government simply seeks to take action, whether it is the immediate increase in the counselling services provided to members of staff, which is already in place, the extension of that services into 24/7 counselling support that provides an immediate way for people who find themselves in these terrible circumstances to be able to bring issues forward and to have them assisted as they would then, I hope, raise these matters with the police. It is why, Mr Speaker, the government agrees happily and has facilitated to put in place the inquiry on a multi-party basis undertaken by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner to ensure that in a multi-party way we deal with the real issues that are associated with the grave concerns. It is why, Mr Speaker, our government moves forward to the 5th National Action Plan for protection of violence against women, Mr Speaker. They're the action.
And I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is building relationships with our regional partners in order to create a peaceful, stable, prosperous and resilient Indo-Pacific?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the interjection was, how's that working from you, Mr Speaker? Well, for Australia, it's working for us pretty well, Mr Speaker, that on the weekend, for the first time, the leaders of the four most significant liberal democracies in our region, Mr Speaker, the United States, Japan, India and Australia, came together at a leaders' level to champion the cause of liberal democracy in the Indo-Pacific, to secure an open and free Indo-Pacific, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can work together as four liberal democracies, as we have sought to do now for many years at other levels, to bring peace and stability to our region. And most importantly, Mr Speaker, to do that through the prism of the ASEAN nations and our great friends in Indonesia, another great democracy in our region, Mr Speaker, and Malaysia and Singapore and so many others. And together, as President Biden and Prime Minister Suga and Prime Minister Modi and I gathered together, we focused on the practical challenges that our region faces. Not just the defence and security and stability issues, but of course the important responses to the global pandemic. And the global pandemic particularly is impacting in our region, and particularly so now as we see the rapid increase in cases to our north in Papua New Guinea, Mr Speaker, where over the last many days I've been involved together with the Minister for Health and the Minister for Foreign Affairs in addressing the increasingly urgent situation there and directly engaged with the Queensland Premier to that end. Mr Speaker, the Quad is a force within the Indo-Pacific to promote peace and stability, to ensure that all countries of the Indo-Pacific can move forward in peace and prosperity, working closely together with each other, with practical initiatives. And it demonstrates that liberal democracies provide the answers to the significant challenges that the world faces, whether it's in responding to climate change, whether it's responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's responding to the issues of developing critical technologies for the future, and the benefits of those technologies can reach all the citizens of our region and can be adopted and done so in a peaceful way. This is a project that our government has championed. This is a project, Mr Speaker, that had fell into disrepair previously. And I'm pleased, Mr Speaker, that our government, over successive years of active diplomacy, Mr Speaker, and with the great support of President Biden, has seen the Quad Leaders initiative become a reality. This has been one of the most significant issues for Indo-Pacific security that we have seen in decades, Mr Speaker, and it speaks volumes to the approach the government is taking to secure Australia's interests, to keep Australians safe, by working hand in glove with the liberal democracies of our region, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we indeed advance Australia fair.
I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer and his statement on indulgence in this parliament yesterday, where he said, "Not far from here, such marches even now are being met with bullets, but not here in this country. It is a triumph of democracy." Does the Prime Minister regret that comment, particularly on the second anniversary of the Christchurch massacre conducted by an Australian citizen?
Members on both sides. The member for Mackellar. The member for Mackellar. Members on both sides. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has engaged, I think, in a very unworthy and egregious slur in this place. Mr Speaker, when has it been a bad thing for a Prime Minister to proclaim the strength of democracy in our country, Mr Speaker? What issue does the Leader of the Opposition have with celebrating democracy and the right to protest, Mr Speaker? What issue could he possibly have, Mr Speaker, other than a twisted attempt, Mr Speaker, to try and pervert what has been said in good faith in this place, to celebrate the fact that Australians anywhere in this country can come and express their concerns? This demonstrates, Mr Speaker, that on this issue the Leader of the Opposition does not act in good faith. He does not act in good faith. But on this issue, Mr Speaker, over many weeks now, has simply tried to twist this issue for his own partisan advantage. He is proving himself unworthy of the office he even holds now, let alone the one he seeks to take.
The member for Shortland. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is providing support to our Pacific Island neighbours for the management of COVID-19, including through the rollout of life-saving vaccines?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, not just for the question but for her service to the Australian health system, a system which, again, today has seen, despite the challenges on the weekend, 0 cases nationwide for the 45th day. But whilst in this year alone, but whilst we are doing well at home, we know that the global pandemic continues. The global pandemic continues to increase in its scope and its challenge, and our region, sadly, is not immune. In particular, we know, as the Prime Minister said, that Papua New Guinea is facing challenges as we speak. So therefore, as part of that, Australia has committed $80 million to the COVAX program to support 92 developing countries. This is at a time where we see that the world has reached 120 million cases, over 2.6 million lives lost agonisingly. But specifically within our region, there is $500 million to support the vaccine rollout program across the Indo-Pacific, to support our Pacific neighbours, to support Papua New Guinea, where $144 million approximately has been put aside. Already, we have been working with PNG with regards to PPE, with the Rita Flynn Testing and Isolation Facility, with regards to Port Moresby General Hospital and other facilities and capacity across the country. Right now, we know that we are seeing an increase in cases in PNG. This is a matter of serious concern for Australia, but even more so, of course, for the wonderful people of Papua New Guinea. And so, as part of that, we are working with Queensland and we are working with PNG in preparing our response to listen to their needs as to what they are seeking from Australia. In particular, we are in a position to be able to assist and support once we've had their full advice in the very near future. And what we are doing, very much so, is ensuring that they have the capacity through vaccines, through the support of an AUSMAT team which has been announced and which will be deployed to assist in Papua New Guinea, and I thank those volunteers that have put themselves forward, and we will continue to provide support within our region. So $80 million for COVAX, $500 million for a regional vaccine initiative, direct support to Papua New Guinea already, but additional support now being prepared in conjunction with Queensland, which, in partnership with the Commonwealth, has set out its priorities, which has included commencing in the Torres Strait Islands vaccinations in Saibai and elsewhere. Already underway. So these things are occurring. We're engaged with PNG, we're engaged with Queensland, we're engaged in protecting our friends and our neighbours.
And I call the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday I asked the Prime Minister if Brittany Higgins was right to say the Prime Minister's office was briefing against her loved ones. The Prime Minister said, "I would never do that," and I've no knowledge of that. 24 hours later, has the Prime Minister asked his office if what Ms Brittany Higgins said is true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I refer to the same answer I gave yesterday.
Members on both sides. Members on my left, the member for McEwen, the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 29th of March 2018, the Attorney-General told the media that the government was considering detailed models for a National Integrity Commission. It's now been 1,111 days since that public statement. Prime Minister, where is the National Integrity Commission Australia was promised?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I thank the member for her question. I'd like to ask the Minister representing the Acting Attorney-General to respond further to the question. But Mr Speaker, as the Attorney-General at the time said, that is the case. We have prepared that model. We've engaged in the consultation process, and that consultation process is continuing. But what is clear is that the proposal that the government has put forward is not supported by other members either of this chamber or the other chamber, Mr Speaker. we are very determined to proceed with the model that we've set out. We believe that that provides the best way of handling the issues, Mr Speaker. But if the parliament is not prepared to support that legislation, Mr Speaker, then that puts us in a rather difficult position in terms of being able to proceed. But I'll ask the minister to add further.
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and recognise the genuineness of her concern in relation to the Integrity Commission, and I think it's important for our country, as we've seen in other states and territories, to get the design right of an Integrity Commission. The Prime Minister pointed out that there is an exposure draft out at the moment which has had over 300 written submissions and 40 consultations in terms of meetings and roundtables have taken place. And we will follow that process through, and hopefully in a form that can be supported in the parliament. I just make this point, Mr Speaker, because I know, again, the honourable member and others have had a keen interest in this for a while. This Integrity Commission deals with serious corruption. That's the proposal here. That's the proposal here. What we need to be very careful about is that we're not straying into a space where we might compromise a criminal investigation or a successful prosecution against somebody in relation to a sexual assault matter. Now, you can scoff at that, but that's the foundation of the legal system in this country. And if the Leader of the Opposition is proposing a departure from that, then he should make that very clear. But this government, Mr Speaker, is going to make sure that we continue the process with the Integrity Commission, and it shouldn't be used for political purposes by those opposite.
The member for New England has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Leader of the Nationals, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the McCormick-Morrison government, through its significant investment in aviation, is supporting local jobs and rebuilding the economy as we continue to recover from the COVID-19 crisis?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for New England for his question, Mr Speaker. And he knows, as well as we all do and should, that keeping our aviation sector viable through this global pandemic is not only crucial to our health outcomes but also vitally important to our economy. The aviation and tourism sectors hit first, hit hardest when this virus came to Australia. The government's measures have been targeted, they've been temporary and they've been scalable. But they've been substantial. They've been substantial. More than $3.8 billion so far. And last Thursday I was joined by the Tourism Minister, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister at Mascot Airport, and as we addressed the media, the roar of the engines could be heard in the background, and that's what we want to hear more of, the roar of those engines. But of course, many planes are grounded, and we know that planes in the air means jobs on the ground. And what we want to do as part of the international aviation support, and what we will do as part of that package of measures, $1.2 billion, is not only get planes back in the air but also keep them the way they need to be. You can't just roll indeed a Boeing 787 or an Airbus 330 out of a hangar and then expect it to fly. It needs a lot of preparation, as do the workers in reskilling and retention of those accreditations. They need that support, and we as the Liberal and Nationals government are giving them that vital support. And you may laugh, and this may be really funny for you, but it's not really funny for the 8,600 workers who are relying on this package, who are relying on this support, who are relying on this investment to ensure that they stay connected with Virgin Australia and with Qantas. And that is why we are providing, indeed, this package. We are ensuring that the international fleet of aircraft are ready and safe to fly. We are ensuring that our airlines retain those 8,600, that's how many there are, international workforce, international aircrew. They are important. And of course, the assistance that we've provided has been sector-wide. Now, just with the aviation support that we've provided as far as the tourism package is concerned, flight searches on Virgin Australia's website increased almost 80%. Bookings increased almost 40%. And about 400 crew are being brought back from the end of March, and it is anticipated that more than 1,000 workers You once supported workers, but you don't obviously anymore, but we do. We'll be stood up or given more hours as demand returns. For Qantas, well, its website searches spiked 73%. So they're good results. We're getting planes back in the air. We're keeping workers with their skills. We're getting on with the job.
Has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Why has the Prime Minister not asked his staff whether they sought to undermine Brittany Higgins' loved ones? Why does the Prime Minister still have a don't ask, don't tell policy?
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I reject the assertion of the question. Mr Speaker, I don't have any knowledge of those matters. I would never instruct my staff to do those, and I have no knowledge of them doing so, Mr Speaker, and none has been presented. Now, Mr Speaker, though, when it comes to those who say that they should be looking into matters in their office, Mr Speaker, I notice that there's been a lot of discussion about the need to listen, and we do need to listen, Mr Speaker, and we are listening and we are taking action on these very sensitive issues that have been raised. The multi-party Jenkins inquiry has been established. The additional services have been put in place. Actions are being taken and further actions will be put in place. But, Mr Speaker, what I do know...
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Very clear question on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. The first part of it goes very specifically to the Prime Minister not asking his own staff, and the second part of it goes to whether or not a particular policy exists within his office.
Well, I think what the Manager of Opposition Business is doing is trying to anticipate the Prime Minister moving away from the relevance of the question. I don't think he's done that yet. I certainly don't think he's done that yet. I'll hear from the Prime Minister. He is able, of course, to give some context to the answer, and I think what he's done so far is within order, but I'm listening.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday at a press conference, the Leader of the Opposition was asked, Mr Speaker,
hang on. I haven't heard what he said yet. You've had your point of order. I am listening. I don't think interjections from the Leader of the Opposition and the Manager of Opposition Business, when the Prime Minister has said yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition at his press conference, he hasn't said anything yet. You're sort of asking me to get into, preventative standing orders. The Prime Minister has the call.
And subsequently in that interview, it was put to him, 2 claims against staffers, that is Labor staffers, last year. What were the women told they should do? In his transcript it says inaudible.
The Prime Minister needs to resume his seat. That cannot be related to this question. It certainly could be related to other questions, but not this one. The member for Bass.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please remind the House how the Morrison government's commitment to lower taxes is helping our economy recover strongly and giving Australian households more of their own money back? Is the Treasurer aware of any credible alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I acknowledge the member for Bass's experience as a local mayor and as a person who's been involved, Mr Speaker, as a farmer before coming to this place. And the member for Bass, like others on this side of the House, believe in lower taxes, Mr Speaker. Lower taxes so that Australians can earn more and that Australians can keep more of what they earn. And as a result of policies that have been passed through the parliament, supported and initiated by those on this side of the House, since last July, $9 billion in lower taxes has passed its way through to the pockets of Australian families. And between March and September, another $12 billion in tax cuts, Mr Speaker, for 11 million Australian workers and families and households, Mr Speaker. So if you're a nurse or you're a teacher earning $60,000 a year as a result of the policy supported by this side of the House, you will pay $2,160 less in tax than you would have back in 2017-18, Mr Speaker. And on this side of the House, we've also legislated tax cuts which will see a whole tax bracket abolished, Mr Speaker. A whole tax bracket abolished so that 95% of Australian taxpayers will pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. We'll have one large tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000. This is significant long-term structural reform. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that the Australian people at the last election were presented with a very clear contrast. We supported lower taxes, while those opposite supported $387 billion of higher taxes, Mr Speaker. And we remember the member for Rankin saying how proud and pleased he was of the retirees and the housing tax, Mr Speaker, and describing small business as the top end of town, Mr Speaker. Remember the member from Maribyrnong saying about those taxes he was not for turning. He was not for turning, and retirees, Mr Speaker, were on the back of their yachts, Mr Speaker. We remember those opposite and their $387 billion of higher taxes. Higher taxes, Mr Speaker, on people's superannuation, on their income, on small businesses, on their savings and on their housing. And just last week, the Leader of the Opposition had the opportunity to say that he supported our legislated stage 3 of the tax cuts, and he couldn't even bring himself to say that. He just said, let's have to wait and see. We on this side of the House support lower taxes.
Concluded. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports that if the Prime Minister allows the Attorney-General to resume his duties without an independent inquiry, the Attorney-General's portfolio will be restructured. In the light of the serious sexual assault allegations levelled against the Attorney-General and a related defamation action, can the Prime Minister tell the House what ministerial functions he intends to allow the Attorney-General to perform?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the abundance of caution and to avoid any perception of any conflicts of interest that may arise, the Attorney-General, when he returns, will not perform certain functions of his office that may relate to the Federal Court or to the ABC.
The member for MALLEE.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister please update the House on the bipartisan approach adopted by successive Commonwealth governments to reduce violence against women and children, particularly through the National Action Plan?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for MALLEE for her question. Her work with vulnerable young mothers and their children with her Zoe's support service is incredibly well known and well recognised across rural Australia. Mr Speaker, there is no excuse for family and domestic violence, and everyone does have a role to play, including governments. In fact, it was the Gillard government that commenced the first national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, starting in 2010 and leading up to 2022. It had 6 national outcomes, including respectful relationships and holding perpetrators to account. Upon coming to government, we continued this process, and since 2013, we've committed more than $1 billion to reduce violence against women and their children through a variety of initiatives. Many of them focused on prevention, which is a key theme of the National Action Plan. We've boosted frontline and counselling services, providing safe places, prevention strategies for implementation in communities, workplaces and homes, and of course the very well-known Stop It at the Start campaign. We're now working on the next national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. And of course we recognise that violence doesn't occur in isolation from issues such as justice, housing, health, disability, children and education, and they are all part of the work we are doing in our social services portfolio. Now, I'm looking forward to the next plan having an even stronger focus on rural and regional areas and rural and regional women, where, sadly, the statistics are confronting. 23% of women experience intimate partner violence in rural and regional Australia compared to 15% in the city. And the unfortunate reality is that women in regional towns face incredible barriers to accessing support. Sometimes there is just nowhere to go, particularly when everyone knows who you are. And I know that the member for MALLEE and other members look forward to leading those local consultations about how we can indeed do more. But there are many things that we are doing, and as I said yesterday, we're not standing still. In addition to the 24-hour support line 1800's Respect, successive governments have looked at providing special training to frontline workers, including general practice in rural and regional Australia, helping the people who are there on the spot recognise the signs of domestic violence and giving people, women, the confidence to come forward to them. We've provided additional funding to White Ribbon Day, expanding it into rural and regional areas and promoting men who stand up and say they will not tolerate these things. The focus on shifting attitudes and early intervention is happening through a range of measures. Violence against women and their children is never acceptable. This government and this parliament is committed to stopping it.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Former Solicitor-General Justin Gleeson SC says the allegations against the Attorney-General should be referred to the current Solicitor-General. Why did the Prime Minister not seek the Solicitor-General's advice before he declared that the rule of law would be harmed by an independent inquiry into sexual assault allegations against the Attorney-General? Who provided the legal advice to support the Prime Minister's declaration?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for a question. The advice as suggested by the former Solicitor-General was not advice that was tendered to me by the government, and the advice that I followed and the advice that I sought came from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I also consulted, Mr Speaker, with the Commissioner of the Federal Police in handling these matters and raising these matters with the Attorney-General.
Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, there are established processes for dealing with all members, whether it be in this House, Mr Speaker, former members of this House, any Australians, that they all face one rule of law. They all face one rule of law. And, Mr Speaker, it's important that consistent standards are applied. Consistent standards are applied, Mr Speaker, when it comes to such sensitive issues, when it relates to allegations of sexual assault. And I quote, Mr Speaker, the member for Maribyrnong, when he was the subject of such allegations, when he said— the police—
Prime Minister, resume his seat. Member for Sydney will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business is seeking the call, and I now give him the call. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance.
Well, I'll rule that the Prime Minister is still being relevant to the question. There was a preamble, and essentially one question was why and the other one was who, and he's giving some context for the stance that he has taken on behalf of the government, and I think he is in order at this point.
It's a matter of consistency, and as the member for Maribyrnong rightly said at the time, he said the police have concluded their work, they've made their decisions, and now I think it's appropriate to draw a line under the matter, and that's what I'm going to do. Mr Speaker, that position was supported by then Prime Minister Abbott, who said apparently it's been dealt with by the police, and I don't think there's really anything more to say about it. So it seems that is at an end, Mr Speaker. And then I quote the member for Sydney herself, Mr Speaker, who said we should now be able to draw a line under it. Mr Speaker, on this matter, the police have concluded their dealings with this matter, and as a result, Mr Speaker, I have applied exactly the same approach to this matter as was applied to the member for Maribyrnong. Mr Speaker, the double standards that the Labor Party are seeking to apply here are simply quite galling. They're simply quite galling.
The member for Maribyrnong was right to say that then, but the member for Sydney says that it's not right for others to say it now, Mr Speaker. This is a clear demonstration that the Labor Party is not engaging this issue in good faith. The Labor Party is simply trying to exact political opportunity from the terrible trauma and circumstances that staff face in this office, Mr Speaker. Even now, the Labor Party knows that there are allegations
members for Dunkley and
issues that have been raised about the conduct of staff and members on that side of the House. That is a matter for them to deal with to get their own house in order, but when they're standing in glass houses, they should not be throwing these types of stones.
Member for Sydney, members on both sides. The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House?
We'll pause for a second. I've made it abundantly clear that interjections are out of order, particularly when I'm listening to a question or an answer. So I think the member for Isaacs knows what I'm about to say. He can leave under 94A. And the member for Curtin can resume her question again, and we'll restart the clock.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's ongoing support for training and skills development is creating a skilled workforce for now and the future that will help build a stronger Australia? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And she and I both know how important skills training is for the future workforces. Now, businesses from Cottesloe on the west coast all the way through to Coolangatta on the east coast and, quite frankly, everywhere in between have always employed apprentices. And we want to encourage them to continue to engage and take on apprentices. Now, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is very proud to be putting apprentices at the centre of our economic recovery. And that's why in the budget last year we announced the Boosting Apprenticeship Commencement Wage Subsidy as part of our $74 billion JobMaker plan. Now, we've supported 100,000 places with that wage subsidy since October last year, and that includes 980 in the member for Curtin's electorate. Now, this subsidy is already supporting the creation of more than 9,000 future bricklayers, carpenters and joiners, 8,000 future electricians, 7,000 future mechanics and over 12,000 people in retail and hospitality work. Now, Mr Speaker, the take-up for that program was so strong that it had reached its capacity within 5 months, and that's why last week we announced an extra $1.2 billion to support another 70,000 new apprentices and trainees to make sure that businesses had the skilled workforce that they needed to be able to grow. Now, Mr Speaker, the Boosting Apprenticeship Commencement Wage Subsidy provides a full 12-month support when an apprentice or trainee begins before the 30th of September this year. And I encourage all business owners that are contemplating taking on an apprentice to do so, to support our young people and those that are willing, ready and able to take on an apprenticeship. Give them a go. There has never been a better or more important time for businesses to take on an apprentice. Now, Mr Speaker, this wage subsidy is one of a raft of measures that we've put in place in the skills and training sector, and our government is making significant strategic record investments to ensure our skills development is the envy of the world. And we're doing that because we know it's good for businesses, it's good for workers and it's good for our nation. We are focused on very practical outcomes that provide an opportunity for all Australians, whether it's our business owners that are wanting to expand, our workers who are looking to upskill, right through to our school leavers who might be looking now for their first job. We understand how important it is to make sure that our workers are skilled for the future.
Just before I call the member for Sydney, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon His Excellency Mr Shingo Yamagami, the new Ambassador of Japan, on behalf of the House. So, very warm welcome to you here to the House of Representatives. And I'd also like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon Lisa Singh, a former Senator for Tasmania, in the gallery here on my left on behalf of the House. A very warm welcome to the House of Representatives. And I call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. During the election campaign on May 4th, 2019, the Prime Minister said about rape, and I quote, "One of the things that often happens with that is they're not believed and their stories are not believed. It's important that their stories are believed and that they know if they come forward, their stories will be believed." End quote. Why then did the Prime Minister decide a written complaint sent directly to him wasn't true, even without reading it?
Good question. The members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
I said to the House yesterday I was very familiar with the contents of those documents. I was briefed on them by none less than the Commissioner of the Federal Police, Mr Speaker, before they were even received in my office. And I asked the Commissioner of Police whether it would be appropriate for me to raise those matters directly with the Attorney-General, and he said yes, and I did so immediately, Mr Speaker. And these are matters that are ultimately matters that have to be determined by police and prosecutors at the end of the day. But, Mr Speaker, I stand by the comments I said on that occasion, because it is important, Mr Speaker, that the earnestness in which these matters are brought forward by individuals is believed so they can be taken forward to the police. But, Mr Speaker, their ultimate truth and veracity and whether matters can be taken forward is a matter for the police. That was certainly the case in relation to the member for Maribyrnong. The police undertook their inquiries. They concluded their matter. I understand a brief of evidence may be prepared and was forwarded to the prosecutors in Victoria, and they decided not to proceed with the case. That is our justice system, Mr Speaker. That is our justice system. And we act in accordance with the justice system and the rule of law. In relation to the allegations against the Attorney-General, the police have concluded the matter. And in the same way that the matter was concluded with the member for Maribyrnong. Now, this may be inconvenient to the member for Sydney, who think it's okay to apply one rule to a Labor member, Mr Speaker, but a different rule to a member of the government, Mr Speaker. I note that this is true also, Mr Speaker. The member for Boothby. The member for Boothby was the victim, Mr Speaker, of an outrageous campaign mounted by Labor, the Get Up and the unions at the last election, Mr Speaker. I did not hear the member for Sydney decrying the disgraceful treatment of the member for Boothby. I did not hear Senator Wong describe the misogynist and disgraceful attacks where the member for Boothby feared for her own safety from the members of the Labor Party. When it came to claims of this matter, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have very selective hearing, Mr Speaker, very selective hearing. By contrast, Mr Speaker, our government, myself and former Prime Minister Abbott, when confronted with a very similar situation, took the principled view that the rule of law applies equally to every single Australian.
And I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is developing and delivering a world-class defence industry that is creating jobs and delivering essential capability for our ADF as we come back from the COVID-19 recession? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question and acknowledge her interest and passion for Australia's defence industry, but particularly in South Australia. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's record $270 billion investment in defence is creating world-class defence industry right here at home in Australia. We're creating thousands of Australian jobs and delivering new opportunities for Australian businesses to supply essential capability for our men and women in uniform. Mr Speaker, we are supporting Australian businesses at home and abroad, and we are incredibly proud of that. And a good example is the partnership between industry and defence to deliver the Boeing Loyal Wingman in Melbourne. Mr Speaker, the Boeing Loyal Wingman is the first locally designed and built military aircraft in Australia in some 50 years. And recently we met a major milestone with the Loyal Wingman when we embarked on its inaugural flight. And we're going to build upon our investment in this program, Mr Speaker. And we will invest a further $115 million in this program, where we will acquire another 3 additional aircraft, securing over 100 Australian jobs. Jobs, Mr Speaker, that will be found all around Australia, not only in South Australia but Queensland and also in regional Victoria. Mr Speaker, more good news for South Australia. We have just recently announced that the Morrison government has signed a $150 million contract with BAE Systems Australia. This is a contract to support the production for the next generation Nolka decoys and launchers for our Navy. This is a capability that provides our ADF with leading-edge countermeasures to protect Australian warships, Mr Speaker. And this investment will support some 90 jobs and Australian SMEs in South Australia and across the country. Mr Speaker, our Australian defence industry knows that the Morrison government has spent the last 8 years reversing Labor's failure and neglect for our Australia's defence industry. Not only did they cut $18 billion from our defence budget, but they failed to commission a single Australian-built ship, Mr Speaker. And history has shown that this left thousands of Australians without work and also increased the risk of the defence of our nation, Mr Speaker. So what has the Morrison government done? We're very proud of our record. We have commissioned 12 attack-class submarines, 21 Pacific patrol boats, and we can't forget those 9 Hunter-class frigates and the 12 offshore patrol vessels. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is getting on with the job of the defence of our nation, and at the same time we are creating a world-class, homegrown, sovereign defence industry.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the call by the Deputy Leader of the National Party in the Senate, Senator Canavan, for the rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine to be suspended reflect government policy? Does the Prime Minister agree that the repeated freelancing from government members on COVID vaccinations has the potential to seriously undermine public confidence in the vaccine rollout?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course it doesn't represent government policy, Mr Speaker. I think that at all times Australians should be looking to the official advice, which is based on the medical expert opinion of the government's advisers when it comes to vaccinations, Mr Speaker. And I think it is incumbent on all of us here in this place to be supporting that vaccination program. All of us should be doing that, Mr Speaker, not trying to seek to undermine it, Mr Speaker, by making false claims about rollouts, Mr Speaker, or anything like that. We've seen that quite a bit from the opposition, Mr Speaker, over the course of this pandemic. We've seen quite a bit of the opposition talking about both sides of their mouths, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the government's leadership, when it comes to responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic response of the government. So, Mr Speaker, yes, the government's policy when it comes to the vaccination program is very clear, and I would encourage all members to be supporting the government in the rollout of the vaccination and not seek to undermine it, Mr Speaker. And I'd ask the Minister for Health to add further the answer.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And the government clearly, unequivocally, absolutely supports the AstraZeneca rollout. Clearly, unequivocally, absolutely. And the reason why is very simple. It will help save lives and protect lives. And it's done so on the basis of the medical advice. Today, the government has had renewed advice supporting that vaccination program from the Chief Medical Officer of Australia, from the Therapeutic Goods Administration of Australia and from the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation. The TGA today has said the TGA does not have any evidence of a biologically plausible relationship that could suggest a cause and effect relationship between vaccination and blood clots. The Chief Medical Officer of Australia has said the Australian government remains confident in the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine and there is currently no evidence that it causes blood clots, and the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation has said, based on evidence to date, ATAGI do not see any reason to pause use of the AstraZeneca vaccine in Australia. That's in accordance with the advice of the World Health Organisation. It's in accordance with the advice of the European Medicines Agency and with the United Kingdom's MHRA. It's also what we see in relation to our own evidence here in Australia. So our view is crystal clear and unequivocal. We support this program. We support the continued rollout. There have been views expressed. We disagree with them. Clearly, absolutely, unequivocally. So that is our position. At the same time, by the end of today, we expect to reach 200,000 vaccinations, 45,000 people in aged care, over 500 aged care facilities. So these vaccines will save lives and protect lives.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is protecting Australian families from the threat posed by dangerous non-citizen criminals? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, Mr Speaker, and thank him for standing up in his local community to make sure that people are safe in the city of Townsville and the surrounding areas. And he strongly supports, Mr Speaker, like all people on this side of the House, the government's policy in relation to cancelling visas of dangerous criminals, of people that have committed serious offences against Australian citizens. And, Mr Speaker, the word doesn't need to be taken, Mr Speaker, at face value. Look at the results. Look at what we've done in relation to these visa cancellations. And to the Prime Minister's credit, in 2014 we changed the law because we were quite amazed when we came into government and saw the fact, Mr Speaker, that very few people, particularly those who had committed the most heinous offences against children and women and men in this country, were allowed to stay in our country and to repeat those offences against further victims. So, Mr Speaker, we make no apology for having ramped up that program and done it in a dramatic way. For example, Mr Speaker, I have been incredibly proud, and I've informed the House of this on a number of occasions, of the $70 million that we've invested into the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, because, Mr Speaker, that is saving children from harm. Young boys and young girls. And, Mr Speaker, we are, I think, landing a very significant blow on those pedophiles and sexual predators who seek out Australian children as their victims. But, Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there, because with the visa cancellations, we have been able to cancel 309 visas for rape and other sexual offences during the Prime Minister's time as the Immigration Minister, during my time, and our successes in that portfolio. And, Mr Speaker, that compares to, for the previous 6-year period, 43. Now, Mr Speaker, we have made it our business to make sure that we can work with the authorities here and overseas to identify who these offenders are, and we make no apologies for it. In fact, we've cancelled now the visas of 6,300 non-citizen criminals. These are people who, unbelievably, when you look at their criminal histories, have gone on for years and years and years to commit criminal offences, including sexual assault and rape, against subsequent victims. And, Mr Speaker, I am proud of this government for the way in which we have kicked these people out of our country. Mr Speaker, they will not offend again against Australian women and children. Mr Speaker, we will not allow them. I take the interjection from the member for Solomon, who has been against this legislation, and he should explain to his community where there has been an outrageous spike, Mr Speaker, in relation to the numbers who have committed sexual offences against children. And he should start, Mr Speaker, with action like we have and stop the nonsense rhetoric that he continues, as do many others opposite, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister had committed to 4 million vaccinations by the time JobKeeper is cut. The Prime Minister is running nearly 4 million vaccinations short of his own target. Why is the Prime Minister so quick to rip away JobKeeper but so slow to roll out vaccines?
The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I preempted the Leader of the Opposition's question in my last answer, where I made it fairly clear, Mr Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party speak out both sides of their face when it comes to the government's response to the pandemic. On one side, they pretend to support these measures, whether it's been JobKeeper, the vaccination program, the unprecedented support which has ensured that we've stood by Australians, and on the same hand, Mr Speaker, they talk out the other side of their mouth, seeking to undermine the very things that has ensured that this country has led the world in both our economic and our health response. Now, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the vaccination, it may be a mystery, Mr Speaker, to the Leader of the Opposition, that of the 3.8 million vaccines we'd contracted from overseas, 700,000 were able to be provided because of the desperately serious situation that we find in Europe. But regardless of that point, Mr Speaker, we said back in February, Mr Speaker, that we would be hitting around 80,000 a week in the early weeks. Well, we've already hit that mark in the early weeks, Mr Speaker. We already advised back in February, Mr Speaker, that the 4 million tasks would not be hit because of the disruption in supply that occurred, and that Mr Speaker, that target would be pushed back. The Leader of the Opposition seems to think that we're living in a pandemic, Mr Speaker, that does not have uncertainties. The Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, if he sat in my chair during this crisis, Australians would be despairing, Mr Speaker, because he would not have had the ability to pull together the response that this government has. Now, I'm happy for the Minister for Health to add further to this answer, Mr Speaker, but the vaccination program will continue to roll out. It will reach all Australians with the first dose by the end of October, Mr Speaker, and every single day we will work hard to deliver that vaccination program, despite the undermining, Mr Speaker, of a Leader of the Opposition who even seeks to play politics with the pandemic.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday there were over 18,000 vaccinations in Australia. Next week we move to the following phase, when the supply from Australia's domestic sovereign manufacturing comes on board. And that phase will see us receiving approximately 1 million vaccines a week. It will allow us to move to some hundreds of thousands of vaccinations a week as we build up through over 1,000 GPs in the first part of that, and then ultimately to 4,000 general practices. And yes, it's been based on supply. When the international situation saw a collapse, we made sure that we had sovereign vaccine manufacturing, and that's what's protected Australia. They can pretend it didn't occur overseas. We're upfront about that, but we preempted, we protected and we prepared.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to ensuring Australian families and business have access to the affordable and reliable energy that we all rely on? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and, of course, for her strong commitment, like all of us on this side of the House, to affordable, reliable energy, Mr Speaker, because she knows how important that is to the economic recovery in places like her electorate on the Central Coast. She also knows how important it is to small businesses like Simply Smashing, that's particularly dependent on affordable, reliable energy, Mr Speaker, and I can confirm to the House that our plan is working. Our plan is working. We've seen 7 consecutive quarters of year-on-year wholesale price reductions, Mr Speaker. Last year alone, we saw a 9% reduction in electricity prices in the CPI, Mr Speaker. Unprecedented reductions in electricity prices. And crucial to ensuring we continue to see that affordable, reliable energy in our system is having enough dispatchable power in our energy systems, Mr Speaker. And as we look to the closure of Liddell in April 2023, we know that it has to be replaced with genuine, affordable, reliable generation, Mr Speaker. And we've said we'd prefer the private sector to step up, but if they don't, we'll step in. And I was just a couple of weeks ago up at Kurri Kurri looking at the early works on the Snowy Hydro project up there. It's ready to go, Mr Speaker. It's ready to go to build that affordable, reliable gas generation that will fill the gap as Liddell closes in April 2023, Mr Speaker, and will complement the record levels of investment we're seeing in renewables in this country, alongside the investment we're making in 2,500 megawatts of capacity in the Snowy 2 project, Mr Speaker, and $250 million of investment in interconnection and priority transmission projects, Mr Speaker. But I was asked about alternatives. And the alternative, of course, is the indecision and division of those opposite, Mr Speaker, because under the cover of darkness, they recently released their national platform where they heralded their peace deal on gas, Mr Speaker, a peace deal on gas. Now, there was 111 pages there of waffle. There was no plan, there was no policy, and there was certainly no peace deal, Mr Speaker. Just ask the member for Hindmarsh, who said gas won't underpin our recovery, or the member for McMahon who replaced him when he was sacked, Mr Speaker, who failed to back a new gas generator, not once, but twice on ABC radio, Mr Speaker, was the member for Hunter. He said hallelujah, hallelujah when we announced our project up at Curry, Mr Speaker. But as the member for Hunter said, the member for McMahon still has his training wheels on. He still has his training wheels on. Well, Mr Speaker, there might be a new face, but nothing has changed. It's the same old Labor.
The member for Lilley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. More than 5,500 workers in my electorate of Lilley are going to lose JobKeeper at the end of the month. It's nearly $3 million in support that's about to be ripped away. So my question is, how many of these workers who are on JobKeeper are going to lose their jobs now because of your cuts?
The Treasurer, Mr Cool.
Mr Speaker, the good news for the member for Lilley is that over 19,000 people have graduated off JobKeeper in her electorate, Mr Speaker. Now that is a 74% graduation rate, Mr Speaker, a 74% graduation rate. Now, Mr Speaker, somebody said in this place about JobKeeper, we haven't said to extend it. Who was that, Mr Speaker? Who was that? The Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition. Then you have the member for Rankin who can't get a question, not even in budget week, who said there's no substitute for an extension of JobKeeper. So the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Rankin are not on the same page, not just on JobKeeper but on a lot of other areas too, Mr Speaker. Now the reality is JobKeeper's been a remarkable program at a cost of around $90 billion. It supported 3.6 million Australian workers and nearly 1 million Australian businesses. But it was always a temporary, targeted program. It was emergency support. Initially it was for 6 months and we extended it for another 6 months, Mr Speaker. We extended it for another 6 months. But the advice from Treasury is that as the economy strengthens, if you leave JobKeeper in place, it has a number of characteristics that are counterproductive to the economy. It prevents an efficient allocation of workers to other roles and it can prop up some unsustainable businesses, Mr Speaker. So the reality is, as JobKeeper comes to the end, other economic supports are in place put there by the Morrison government. The tax cuts, Mr Speaker, the JobMaker hiring credit, the infrastructure projects that were brought forward, the training places, Mr Speaker, the 340,000 skilled places. These are other economic support programs that are designed to create jobs across the economy. And the other key point, Mr Speaker, is that there is $240 billion on household and business balance sheets that was not there this time last year. That is money that will be spent across the economy helping to create jobs. So JobKeeper will come to an end, but there are other measures being put in place to help create jobs and to see Australians get back to work.
The member for Dawson.
Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormick government's commitment to the resources sector, including coal mining, is contributing towards Australia's economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, can I thank the honourable member for Dawson for his question? And Mr Speaker, there's no stronger supporter of the resources sector than the member for Dawson, well, except for the member for Capricorn and the member for Flynn, the member for Herbert, pretty much all of them, Mr Speaker. They're all pretty strong. But the member for Dawson, Mr Speaker, has been so busy supporting the 55,000 full-time jobs, the people in 55,000 full-time jobs in his electorate, directly and indirectly supported by the resources sector. He hasn't even had time for a haircut, Mr Speaker. He's been out busy every single day. But, Mr Speaker, one of the mines in Queensland, I got an update on the weekend, Bravis, formerly known as Adani, out there once again providing jobs, 2,200 people employed on the site, $1.5 billion in contracts issued, 88% of those contracts going to Queensland businesses, and they are driving that economy in central Queensland right through the north, Mr Speaker. In fact, the additional $1.5 billion contracts provides 9,000 indirect jobs being created in the local community. 9,000. So what a great outcome. One that certainly wasn't supported by those opposite, I know that. But while I was there, Mr Speaker, we launched the 2020 edition of Australia's Identified Mineral Resources Report. Great report, Mr Speaker, launched in Mackay, demonstrated once again $291 billion from the resources sector in 2019-20. And in fact, investment in mineral exploration increased by 21% compared to the previous year, reaching $2.6 billion. In fact, there's been a gold rush, Mr Speaker. 40% of that exploration expenditure is due to the strong gold price and is looking for gold. Now, there are all sorts of opportunities in the resources sector, Mr Speaker. For anyone that's looking for a job, there's plenty of work out there in the regions, I know that. But I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about alternatives. Now, I note the member for McMahon actually found central Queensland in recent weeks. Found a mine. I was surprised as you are, Mr Speaker. But I can just imagine...
You won't bring me into it, thank you.
I can just imagine it, Mr.
Or you'll
Speaker,
be surprised. You mightn't get to finish your answer.
Early, looking in the mirror, trying to get the mouth to form the word coal, practising. Can I say coal? I can do it. I can do it, Mr. Speaker. Reaching for the wardrobe, flicking through, suit, skivvy, turtleneck, suit. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that those opposite finally managed to find a coal mine. Finally managed to find a coal mine. However, Mr. Speaker, as the Shadow Minister for Energy, I've got to say the member's been misled, because I'm not sure that he noticed. He actually went not to a thermal coal mine, an energy coal mine, but a met coal mine. So here we are, finally, someone from those opposite in a relatively senior portfolio found their way to a coal mine. But the people in the resources sector, Mr. Speaker, will not be misled. They know that they're not believers. They know those opposite don't support them. They don't want them to have a job. And this side will continue to support the resources sector and support it strongly.
The member's time has concluded. The member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. More than 10,000 workers in my electorate of Parramatta will lose JobKeeper at the end of this month, with more than $5 million a week in support ripped away by this Prime Minister. How many workers in my electorate who are now on JobKeeper will lose their jobs because of the Prime Minister's cuts?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The good news for the member from Parramatta is that 19,064 members of her electorate have graduated off JobKeeper, Mr. Speaker. That's a graduation rate of 67%, Mr. Speaker. A 67%. And when it comes to tax cuts, 85,000 members of her electorate are going to get tax cuts. Now, the reality is that the JobKeeper program was always a temporary targeted measure. A temporary targeted measure, and, Mr. Speaker, it was emergency support, but it's coming to an end. And I point out to the member for Parramatta that since September, 2.7 million Australians have graduated off JobKeeper. And in that quarter, we reduced by half the direct financial support from the Morrison government between September and December. Yet 350,000 jobs were created in that time, Mr. Speaker. So we understand it's going to be a bumpy time from here when JobKeeper ends, but the key focus for the government is helping to keep people in work and helping those who are out of work to get back into work, and we have a number of policies designed to do exactly that.
And I call the member for Wentworth.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's immigration policy has contributed to Australia's economic success and how it will continue to drive growth as the Australian economy recovers from the COVID-19 recession? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank the member for Wentworth for his question, and certainly in his role as a former senior diplomat for Australia, he supported Australia's migration program, and I thank him for it. Today, of course, Australia is one of the most successful migrant countries in the world. We know migrants have been part of that essential economic success that we've seen, and migration, certainly well-managed programs and skilled programs, support economic activity and jobs growth and creation throughout our country. As Australia recovers from the pandemic, we know that migration is going to be vital, play a vital role in supporting that recovery, in enabling jobs growth, especially through our regions, and making sure that we have skilled migrants is a key priority of the Morrison government. We know over the course of the pandemic we were able to attenuate and alter the program to match the conditions that we saw in a 1-in-100-year crisis. But that's why the government did things like establish the global task force on business and talent attraction to ensure we're in the competition for high-value businesses, skills, people with brains and capital, people who want to come to Australia, aligned with our JobMaker program. It's also why we created the priority skills list and ensure that we retain those critical skills in the economy, health, aged care. We're in the competition to make sure people stayed here and had the opportunity to stay and do their jobs and help us out, and we thank them for it. It's this government that knows also that temporary visa holders in Australia play a critical role in supporting the economy, supporting regions, in jobs growth and job creation. We know it, Australians know it, regional communities know it, and we're going to continue to support temporary migration to support our economy. But I'm asked about alternative policies, Mr Speaker. And there is alternative policies to the government's approach, I'm happy to say. In May last year, the shadow immigration spokesperson, Senator Keneally, wrote an article entitled, "In the middle of a 1-in-100-year pandemic, do we want migrants to return in the same numbers?" The answer is no, Mr Speaker. That's the title of the article. In the article, Senator Keneally proceeded to argue for a substantial cut in immigration to Australia. This would somehow support economic recovery. And I'm pleased to say, as an alternative policy, this was met with universal condemnation by members of this House, Mr Speaker, including, I'm pleased to say, my friend the member for Cowan, who noted that Senator Keneally could have expressed her arguments better. I certainly agree with her on that. Former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr, a very successful Premier, I might add, Mr Speaker, said that Senator Keneally should drop her, quote, "Jobs for Australians First" rhetoric, declaring the very loose language showed signs of dog whistling, Mr Speaker. These are the kinds of alternatives that are not good alternatives for Australia, Mr Speaker. It's this government that understands that migration supports economic growth, will support recovery, and we support skilled and well-managed migration to Australia.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.